Hello and welcome to the DTC Podcast. I'm Eric Dyck. Today we are privileged to have a conversation with Reza Khadjavi, the driving force behind Motion, a game-changing platform tailored for experienced media buyers who are looking to harness the combined might of creativity and data. In this enlightened chat, we delve into the evolving intricacies of Facebook's advertising algorithm and its impact on strategy for veteran media buyers, the rise and significance of the creative strategist, that rare breed who marries artistic flair with data-driven acumen, the contentious discourse around creative metrics. Are they the bedrock of insightful campaigns or just shiny distractions? Whether you're navigating the choppy waters of ad algorithms or striving to balance art with analytics, this episode promises actionable insights to refine your playbook. Let's get into it.
Iteration is wonderful. We're big proponents of it. But if you're constantly just trying to squeeze all of the juice out of one creative asset, you're going to hit diminishing returns and start testing things that probably don't really move the needle. And so it's things like, is there a value prop that really worked? Is there a key message that seems to really resonate? Is there a hook, like the first 3 seconds of a video, that seems to really capture people's attention, or a video filler that seems to hold on to a lot of attention? People seem to be watching our videos and we kind of show this or that. And so I think the idea is to have those like pillar learnings, those key insights that you believe to be true. And then you go, how do you take those key learnings and then be very creative with them?
Reza, welcome to the DTC Podcast. We talk all the time with different brand owners about how creative is now the new targeting. You've been working in the creative space for a long time. Give me your hero's journey in the e-commerce creative space.
Sure. Yeah. So let's see. In 2015, my co-founders and I started an app in the Shopify App Store. I think at the time there was maybe like 80,000 merchants on Shopify, so extremely early. The app was called Shoelace. We were like automating the sync between Facebook and Shopify, helping you like connect your product catalogs and install your Facebook pixels and all that. Shoelace took all kinds of twists and turns over the 7-8 years that we worked on it. Eventually became a marketing agency. And from there, we started a new company called Motion about 2 years ago that's 100% focused on creative. So it's a creative analytics platform that helps growth teams and creative teams collaborate better with each other by being able to look at the visual assets and explore the data in one place. There's often a really big gap and divide between the performance side of the house and the creative side of the house. And more than ever, it's just really important for those two teams to be in like full harmony. And so Motion helps with that. And we work with a lot of amazing brands and agencies today, and super excited about what we've built there.
Yeah, we talk about this all the time, and I remember Shoelace. I had these ideas of, I forget what exact product I was on, but this idea of sort of like narrative retargeting, where you're kind of walking users through a story that you're telling with ads, which is a really kind of romantic idea. And I think there's an aspect of that is so essential in today's creatives. Like again, another thing that everyone talks about on this podcast is your need to structure your creatives by where people are in the funnel, structure your campaigns by where people are in the funnel, top, middle, and bottom. And so I had this idea of like storytelling through creatives, which I think was probably a little bit too much, but you definitely need to be structuring your creatives to appeal not only to different angles, as we talk about, like through the pilot test. Your creative now has to identify and target your users and bring them in like a fishing lure kind of, but then you also need to be structuring them by top, middle, and bottom of funnel. And I imagine that's where something like Motion comes in, where you're able to sort of see the trends that are working across these different axes and help you create more winning creatives.
Yeah. So the whole thing is like, how like just kind of taking a couple steps back even from there. It's like the teams that perform the best are the ones that operate in this sprint cycle capacity, where at first they have a hypothesis that they want to test, and then they build creative around that hypothesis. They go and test it. They go and see what the insights are around that, use those insights to then, create this like flywheel and feedback loop into even better, more educated hypotheses going forward. And so a lot of times you see teams that are not doing that at all, kind of just like creating whatever and seeing what sticks. And so creating some organization around that becomes really important, where the hypothesis comes first before the creative is even produced, as opposed to let's create a bunch of content and then see if we can come up with some hypotheses there. And so, yeah, to your point around trying to understand lots of different things, like where somebody is in their buying journey, different personas that you might want to target, different value props that you want to put forward. The idea is to have a lot of assumptions around what might be the biggest needle mover on this piece of creative, and what do we think we're trying to achieve here with this one asset. Produce that and see if it delivered on what you were hoping for. And yeah, to the point around creative is the new targeting, a lot of times that's where that happens. Now, if you want to talk to a specific demographic, very rarely are media buyers fine tuning that in the ad campaigns, and it's all kind of baked into the creative. So that's the one thing that we've seen quite often with the teams that do well with performance creative, is this like, how do you come up with a hypothesis first and then build your creative, and then kind of use that as your learning loop as you build more assets and you ship them.
And how do you hone it in a way? We were just talking about A/B testing yesterday. I think a lot of people do A/B testing where they're like, oh, I learned something, and then they'll A/B test again, and then, oh, I learned something. But if you're not honing, if you're not like stacking your learnings in a strategic way, you may not see the progress you want. It may end up being more, you hit random success on different A/B tests, but if you're not actually honing your learnings down, you're not going to get, the winners that you want.
Yeah. One of the things, so we and we can get into creative strategy and what we're thinking about as like the rise of a creative strategist is a very important role that's emerging in our space, I believe. And when we talk about that role, we always mention the balance between the art and science of this new discipline, right? And so when you think about like classic A/B testing, it might be, very, very scientific, and that's great. You kind of want to use that. Whereas the creative work has some element of like artisticness and like creativity to it that has to be understood. And so the way I think you hone that is to try to figure out what are the big learnings, the big insights that seem to be really working with our creative, as opposed to these like micro iterations. We have in our creative strategy summit coming up, we have this one talk that's called "You Can't Iterate Your Way to Advertising Greatness," right? And like iteration is wonderful. We're big proponents of it. But if you're constantly just trying to squeeze all of the juice out of one creative asset, you're going to hit diminishing returns and start testing things that probably don't really move the needle. And so it's things like, is there a value prop that really worked? Is there a key message that seems to really resonate? Is there a hook, like the first 3 seconds of a video, that seems to really capture people's attention, or a kind of video filler that seems to hold on to a lot of attention? People seem to be watching our videos when we kind of show this or that. And so I think the idea is to have those like pillar learnings, those key insights that you believe to be true. And then you go, so that's like kind of the science part. And on the art side, it's like, how do you take those key learnings and then be very creative with them and say, okay, here are the things that we know to be true. Let's come up with a brand new creative concept, doing things that we've never tried before at all. But let's see if we can use these elements that we know to work. And now you have this kind of ingredients way approach to creating new assets that has the like fundamental science aspect to it, where you are being data driven, you are like building on top of your past learnings. But I think it's important to leave room on the second half of that to say, let's make sure we capture these, but now let's try something brand new for this version of creative that we want to try. And I think that's where a lot of learnings become interesting, is when you allow yourself that creative freedom to explore new options, but you're factoring in the elements that you know to work in your creative.
You need to take big swings, and I think we with creative, we talk all the time about the pilot test, which is something the Pilot House does, where you're isolating, you're creating very distinct angles that speak to different aspects of the product, maybe speak to different aspects of your avatar's journey or of different avatars. And it's like you don't always know what you don't know. You have a lot of blind spots, I find, and if you're just if you're optimizing maybe the headline or a color in the image or all of these small things that can make tiny little incremental differences, you can see winners there, but you need to expand those blind spots by taking bigger swings. And the word we use all the time is angles. I think angles is one of the bigger things you need to be thinking about, and making sure you're covering not just one angle with a bunch of little tiny variations. You can do those little tiny variations, but I think you're absolutely right. You got to take these bigger swings when it comes to angle. What are your thoughts on overall creative volume right now? I think a lot of people underestimate what it actually takes to find winners when you're in a scaling phase. I guess you probably work with clients at different phases. What do you say when it comes to creative velocity, creative volume in the D2C game these days?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So we're obviously big believers in it, and our view has always been that it takes a lot of new creative to find winners and to scale campaigns, and to adopt this rigorous approach to your testing. But we wanted to challenge that a little bit. I was on a call with the CMO of Ridge, Connor, and I was playing devil's advocate a bit, and I was asking him, hey, imagine if I was skeptical finance guy that was saying what's the point of all this? Why are we creating all these new assets? What is with this insane velocity? Because they ship a lot of creative, that team. And so I was asking him, assume I'm this skeptic, and I'm poking at your work and your team's work and saying why are we doing this at all? How do you respond to that? And his answer was interesting. He's in some sense, it's not even about performance. We can't get to our scale goals that we have in terms of the media buying budgets that we want to deploy at our company. We can't even get there if we're not producing the volume of creative that we do. So there is this one, the interesting thing about creative, when we think about goal setting and what's the point, what are teams trying to achieve here? There is an element that's of scale that's really important. So if you produce a creative that does really well, but fizzles out, it was a very kind of a niche audience that resonated with that. It didn't work at scale. That's great, but it doesn't really move the needle for the business. And so there is this element of looking at scale and looking at the creatives that actually get spend through the platforms as almost objective number one. And then saying, okay, of the ones that are scaling, how do we get those to scale at the performance targets and the goals that we want them to? So there's this 2-dimension goal to producing your creative. And I think every team that you talk to would acknowledge that it's basically impossible to get to that first scale goal without producing a ton of new creative, whether they're iterations or new assets. And that's true across a number of different, people might set up their campaign structures in a number of different ways. You hear about cost caps a lot these days, and all these other different ways that you might do it. In any scenario, you need a really high volume of creative in order to be able to find the winners that are able to achieve your targets at scale. So yeah, I think volume is a really big part of it.
Doesn't it happen? It's funny, when I first started this podcast, the number of people would come on and be yeah, we made one our first creative was the one that took us over our first 2 years, or there was a lot of stories back in the day of brands that were built on winners that just kept going. Is that happening less and less in this environment? I think your people are always still looking to find winners, but are winners generally fizzling quicker than they did a few years ago at this time?
I think they're definitely fizzling quicker. It also depends on platform. So I've heard, for example, TikTok fizzles way quicker than for example, a winning creative on Facebook might. And I think it's just there's a lot of competition now. There's a lot of demand for attention on the social feeds. And so it's not before, where the social feeds were just kind of early and there wasn't even a ton of content there. So you're competing with a lot of other people who are putting out phenomenal content. People have short attention spans, and the algorithms always are looking for putting out new content. They don't want to constantly deliver the same asset over and over again. So I think it's definitely not what it used to be, but we think about that a lot in terms of the goal of all of this creative strategy work is how do you, let's call those ads that the ones that people talk about that just work for a long time. Let's call those unicorn ads. The idea is, how do you produce more unicorns, right? How do you produce more assets that fit into that Hall of Fame threshold, that run for a really long time and crush your performance goals at that scale for a long time? And I think if teams look at their goals around that, I think it's really important. So sometimes we were talking about iteration earlier. Sometimes you get so lost into this loop of small iterations, you forget that like, no, the goal here is to produce more unicorns. Like that's what we're really trying to achieve. If you look at the distribution of impact of those unicorns compared to like the few assets that maybe did work well, but not at scale, like it's a lot of the ad account is being driven by those big unicorns. So even, I think in this environment where cash is a lot more tight, we're not in this like frothy environment where cash is free flowing. Efficiency and contribution margin, and all these things are becoming like really important. They probably always should have been, but like they're becoming a lot more important these days. And so you can translate the reason why these unicorns are really effective is like those are the ones that have the highest impact on contribution margin because they're working at scale and they're doing so for a long period of time and they're doing so efficiently. And so the idea is how do you produce more of those? And I think if teams are organizing themselves around more home runs, and that's what we're trying to achieve here, I think a lot of the inputs that take people there start to change. So I think it's a really important reminder to say like, we want to produce more of those and judge the performance of our team by the number of new unicorns we're able to produce every month. And I think that can make a really big difference in outcomes.
Amazing. You mentioned Ridge, and I know you work with a lot of great brands. Let's just talk a little bit about team structure and how you mentioned the creative strategist position. It's echoed actually, I think, in the way Pilot House does things. We've always had, for the last several years, we've always had our designing team, our media buying team, and then we have creative managers in the middle, sort of creative strategists who are the ones kind of thinking of the angles, really keeping very close ties to the data and really kind of bridging the gap between the art and science of media buying. How would you say are the best teams that you've worked with, the ones that are kind of using motion to its best abilities? I also just will say I really enjoyed you saying that motion is essentially it's HubSpot. It's an organizational tool, like a HubSpot-esque tool for creative strategists, so they can understand their assets better, get quicker to produce unicorns. But just talk to me a little bit about the team structure that the best teams are using that you find.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different variation there. The commonality that we find in all of the best teams is around the job to be done of this creative strategist. There's still not many teams that have this like formal designation of a person on the team with the title creative strategist, although that's changing quite a bit. Every other week, I see new folks like adding creative strategists to their LinkedIn bio or Twitter or whatnot. But like whether they call themselves that or not is actually like not that important. What's most important is that there's somebody on the team that's doing that work. And I'd say like that's like the pillar of success for a lot of the great teams that we've seen. And so what's the creative strategy job? I think about it as like 4 pillars, 4 blocks of work. Everything that's in between the distribution side. So you're media buying and you're pumping these ads out across different channels, call that the distribution side. You're producing content, right? Video editors and all that to produce the actual assets to bring it to life. Let's call that the creation process. Everything that happens in between those 2 extremes falls into the work of a creative strategist. And whether somebody has that formal job title on the team or not, the best teams I've seen, there's somebody who takes that in-between work really seriously. And so it starts from research is a really big part of that. Qualitative research, looking at what your competitors are doing, different ad formats that might be trending on social. So having a really good eye on what else is going on out there, competitors, brands you're inspired by, et cetera. Reading product reviews, trying to understand what your customers are saying about your products, getting a like deep understanding about customers and how they feel and what makes them tick and what are the value props that they really resonate with. Reading ad comments, try to understand like sentiment analysis of what are people responding to, et cetera. So all that within the research phase. Then there's the analysis part, where it's obviously where motion plays a really big role. But looking at the data, trying to understand what worked, what didn't, creating reports, communicating those insights with everybody else, all of the things related to understanding the data around the performance of your own creatives. So that's the analysis side. Then there's the planning side. So it's like, okay, what's our creative roadmap like? What are the new concepts that we want to test? When are we going to do that? How are those tied to our marketing calendar? And there's a ton of work around that planning phase 2 because because oftentimes people might underestimate the time horizon between when they need to start working on new assets and when they'll need them, or they might create more than they need. So there's actually a lot of work around trying to understand the planning side of like, how much do we need and when do we need it? And are we on course for that? And then the final part is the briefing. So like, who's actually briefing the content creators, briefing the editors, and saying like, this is now from the research we've done, from the analysis we've done out of our own creative, from like the plans that we have now, like this work now needs to be executed. So like the briefing side of things needs to get done. And so like, there's a lot of work there. And oftentimes you'll see that the people on the team are where they're scrambling is that they've not acknowledged like the scope of work and the importance of that work. So we've always been like, this is such a high leverage area of work because you have all this cost associated with the distribution side, media budget cost, agency fees, etc. So much cost associated to the content creation, paying new influencers, producing new assets, etc. Especially at a large enough scale, if you have somebody taking that in-between work really, really seriously, it doesn't take a lot of improvement to see a big impact on downstream efficiency on the distribution side and on the creation side. So I'd say that's the number one most important thing I've seen at any team who's performing really well, is that somebody's taking that job to be done of a creative strategist really, really seriously. And then there's obviously all the obvious things where like, you need a network of content creators that you can rely on to produce new assets, video editors. And I think a lot of the production side becomes another big challenge that teams solve in a number of different ways. I don't know that there's like a perfect answer there, but it kind of boils down to, does your organization have the ability to pump out a large volume of creative quickly? And so however you've solved that problem, if you've built a giant in-house team, wonderful. If you're working with an external partner, great. But solving the problem of being able to produce a high volume of high quality work every single week is another thing that these teams have set up. So I think those are a couple of things that we've seen that seem to be a pattern across the brands who do it well.
And motion provides the foundation for these jobs to be done. It's the backdrop. It's the tool that allows you to do this more efficiently.
Yeah. So our view is like, you can't. And before motion began, we saw a lot of our favorite teams. We had like early customer interviews around trying to solve this problem. We saw a lot of like elaborate spreadsheets and places that people were trying to track this information. And like everyone kind of already arrived at this conclusion that we can't make good decisions around what to do unless we're tracking the data on what we've done and using insights from the past to predict, what we might do in the future. The problem was that it's very difficult to get that done outside of a product like Motion, because the creative team hates spreadsheets, right? They don't resonate with that platform, let's say. And I actually don't even blame them, because if you look at a spreadsheet, it's very difficult to do visual analysis inside of a spreadsheet. It's great for a lot of like number crunching, but as soon as you need to see which video asset are we actually talking about here, it's very hard to...
Qualitative analysis versus like quantitative, right?
Exactly. And even just to the point of saying like, what video are we even talking about here? Video 1234 _ version 6. Like, what is that? Which one is that? I need to play the video. I need to see it. And so motion helps quite a bit with that. And it also helps on the collaboration side. So one of the things about creative analysis that's quite different to maybe other forms of analysis is that it's not a solo person job. The point of creative analysis is to gather insights, to be able to communicate those insights with other people. So you might work with a handful of content creators who are external partners who often create assets for you. You want them to know what's worked. You want them to have a feedback loop of saying like, here are the 5 assets you created for me. Here's how they've done. Or you have like internal teams or an agency partner, and everybody needs to be on the same page about what we've done, what we've tried, what we've learned. And so there's a very strong collaboration aspect to that motion facilitates. So you can create a report, have all the visual insights, click share, paste it in Slack, put it into an email. So we see a lot of times where motion starts to fit into the creative strategy workflow is that ultimately when somebody produces a brief, and wants to communicate to somebody else, here's what we want to try, there's often a motion report linked to that, where it's like, here's my brief, here's the suggestion of where I want to go, and here is an example of why I'm saying this. So like, look at these 4 assets that that my hypothesis is based on. And so it really helps with the collaboration side of things between people who are maybe more data oriented and they need to see more visuals, and people who are more visually oriented, and we kind of bring in the data in one place. So people have described motion as like, it's hard to marry the two worlds of data and creative in some sense, like they're complete opposites, right? And it's very important to bridge those two worlds. And so motion has tried to do that with a collaborative aspect, so that teams can get on the same page around what's worked in the past in order to make better decisions on what to do in the future.
So just give me, just so I haven't actually screen shared the platform. Just give me an idea of what that process actually looks like on motion. So you've got multiple creatives you're testing. They go like, just describe to me what they actually like, what it feels like in the interface. Do things does insight get surfaced to you? Like, oh, by the way, did you know this campaign worked really well? Here, like, just walk me through that process a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So there's a number of different reports. So I've often described motion in the way that people have described the game backgammon, where they described it as it's
old game.
yeah. Well, it's they describe it as easy to learn and hard to master, is like one of my favorite things that they say about that game. And the same is true about motion. So you can come in, and in the most simplest way, one of the cool things that motion does, it'll aggregate all of the instances where that creative is launched. So the media buyers might take one piece of creative and run it across like 10 different campaigns. It might be part of a dynamic creative set. It might be running in all kinds of different places. And in order to get a holistic insight on that one piece of creative is done, you'll have to go and like click into like 10 different campaigns in platform, whereas motion will aggregate that. So imagine if the platforms and most like business intelligence tools, architecturally, they're structured as channel, campaign, ad set, ad, creative, right? Like all the way down. Think of motion as the inverse, where like creative is the top of the pyramid, and we abstract away everything else to like aggregate it and give you an understanding of how that one piece of creative is done. And so you'll be able to see like very quickly the simplest report in motion is you're looking at your top spenders, right? Because it's most important. If you start looking at how creative is performing on the ones that haven't spent a ton, probably not going to learn a lot. So you actually first want to isolate the ones who've gotten meaningful spend. And then from there, you've got your set to analyze, and you can start to compare how they're doing. So we recently launched something called motion metrics, which was a way to facilitate the conversation around jargon like KPIs, like thumb stop ratio and CPAs and all of that like, it's hard to communicate what that is to a creative team. So you might pop your motion metrics on, and we make that really easy. So it'll be like one metric for capture attention. So we'll score a creative on its ability to capture attention as people scroll through their feed, like which creatives did the best job at capturing attention, or another score on holding attention. So how good of a job did this one creative asset do at holding attention? Did people watch this video? Did they stick around? And then so on down the funnel. What are the ones that scored the best on driving traffic? What are the ones that scored the best on conversion? And so whether you use motion metrics or you use your team's own KPIs like CPA, ROAS, et cetera, it's very quick to be able to analyze these creatives against each other, play the video, consume the content, do the hardcore quantitative analysis on looking at the data, and then to your earlier point, play the videos and do a qualitative analysis on like, this video seems to have a really good hook rate. So people are stopping their scroll and watching the first 3 seconds of this video. Interesting. Let me play this video and see like, what did we do there that seemed to capture people's attention that well? But people seem to drop off after. So like the hold rate on this video is brutal. So let me look at the video, try to understand what might have happened there. And so you're oftentimes looking at these creatives in sort of a funnel way and saying, what are the parts of this creative that seem to be really working and what are the parts that are not? And helps you come up with an understanding of, okay, I look at this one creative, it seems to be doing a really good job driving conversions, right? The CPA is like excellent. We love it. It's like it's on par with our goals for the account. But the earlier parts of this video are tanking. People are not stopping their scroll. Barely anybody's watching this video, and not a ton of people are clicking through. So you come up with an idea around that to say, what's a new experiment that I can come up with that uses some of the winning elements of this one creative, but tries to elaborate on the parts of this creative that didn't do as well. And then there's like a whole other aspect of motion, are comparative reports, where you can zoom out at a higher level and say, for example, I'm working with 5 different content creators, and I want to see my performance by content creator and say which one of these content creators are moving the needle for us. And like, you'll be able to do that very easily in motion. Or angles, for example. I'm trying these like 8 different angles. Each angle has like, I don't know, 12 different creatives that I'm testing, but they all follow this angle. And so I want to do this like angle comparison of which angle seems to be resonating. So all the way from very high level strategic comparisons around content creators, angles, ad formats, etc., all the way down to an individual creative and understanding that this one asset is doing a really good job on the first 3 seconds. You start to put those ingredients together and say, okay, I think I've got some winning elements for our next batch of creative. And obviously keeping room for that creativity to come up with like brand new concepts, but it gives you a foundation to build off of, and so that you don't have to like waste a lot of time clicking down spreadsheets. And by the time you do that, you've lost all of your creative mojo, and you don't even feel like coming up with new insights anymore.
I imagine there's a lot of people that just do it in their head too, that are like,
Sure.
"Ooh, I remember that hook did well and that did well." And there's like, I think spreadsheets obviously for the more like mid advanced teams, but there's a lot of media buyers out there just sort of keeping it all in their heads, which is not that great of a process.
Yeah, especially because early on we talked about volume, right? And if it weren't for the intensity of volume required, then maybe you could do it all in your head and kind of just like look at the 1 or 2 creatives and manage it all that way. But as soon as you start crossing like a couple $100,000 a month in media spend, and now we require like dozens of new assets every other week or something like that, it starts to become very difficult to eyeball it. And you really need to like put things down and say, okay, what are the trends that we're seeing? Because there's just a lot more money at stake there, right? Like at that point, when the volume is high and you're creating all this stuff every other week, oftentimes people start getting very frustrated and are like, if I'm being honest, I think I'm just guessing what to do each week, and that doesn't feel right. I need to add a bit more rigor here, and that involves just like putting the data down and being able to build on top of your learnings every week.
Let's just dive in a little bit on creative strategy. You've got a lot of great brands using the product. You see a lot of these kind of creative trends. I see on the platform you break down video versus image ads, and then you've also just got like creative type comparison. From your perspective, what do you have to say about what kinds of creatives are working best on, let's say, Meta these days?
Honestly, it varies. It varies so much. It varies so much from brand to brand. And I think it's somebody on our team, even when it comes to benchmarks, our head of customer success, Kira, when customers ask her like, "Hey, what's a good benchmark for a hook these days?" or like, "What's a good benchmark for XYZ?" Her response is always to people like, "You want to be competing against yourself and not necessarily others." And so I think because there's such a big variety of performance across different types of brands, demographics, et cetera, it's hard to point to like one particular thing. But what seems to work quite well for people is when they have an understanding of who their buyer is, right? And I think that the commonality becomes less about the format of the creative itself, as if they're coming up with some kind of a hack, and it's around like a deep understanding of their customer. Why are they interested in this product? What is it about it that resonates with them? And so I think like the core of what seems, because obviously like we're, the world that we live in is all like direct response. We're creating assets for the purpose of like performance. We're not interested, obviously, like there's a whole question around, can you create more brand awareness through some of these like direct response initiatives? I think the answer is yes, but like ultimately the goal is performance, and we want to drive real results. And I think the way to do that is to have a really good understanding about the customers who are going to buy this product. Who are they like? So I think a lot of people will do like very deep dives around their personas and like look at things like what is the age demographic of the customers that are buying from me. And so if it's for example that the age demographic is an older demographic, maybe you're not doing like this like very fast paced like TikTok style short form video, and you're doing something that resonates more with that larger demographic, older demographic. And so I think that deep understanding about who your customer is and the ways in which they make decisions around buying your product, those those are factored into your creative choices, they tend to work really well because you're making decisions based on real customers and not, the next fad on social media that might not actually fit with your customer demographics. I think that research part of creative strategy is really, really important as like the foundation to some of this work, is to say, who are my customers? What do they want? Why are they buying this product? Reading the reviews of your products and understanding like what are they saying, and using those as a way to come up with your creative insights. And so the reason that varies from person to person is depending on what you find in the intel of your customer demographic, that's going to inform the kinds of formats and the kinds of things that you should test that might work really well with your customers. People refer to this, and like when building any kind of product or even like a software product, it's like a really deep understanding of your customer goes a long way. Sometimes we forget that we're building these things like real people are going to see them. And so like, let's spend a minute to understand who are these people, what do they want, and how do we speak to them more effectively? And that tends to work really well.
That's a very complex answer. If you go on D2C Twitter, the answer is just make ugly ads. I think that's the meme that I see on Twitter all the time. Is that a trend you're seeing? Like it's something we always talk about scrappy at Pilot House, and when it comes to like lead generation for the newsletter, I think it's just like Apple Notes or something, or like written with sticky notes, I think is the meme that like gets the click. Like, is that something you're seeing, that ugly ads that sort of jar people in the newsfeed do well, or is that again just totally dependent on the brand?
I think it's dependent, but there's a lot to it. I think that's one trend that obviously has picked up quite a bit. And I think there's a couple of dimensions to it. One is ultimately what you're trying to do is stand out, right? Like if we're producing a creative, the worst thing that you want is to be just like glossed over. And oftentimes when what you're producing looks and feels like everything else and kind of sticks out like a sore thumb as like a well-polished ad creative, then people might just tune that out and just like scroll past it. But like, I think the essence behind something like the ugly ad idea is you want to capture attention. You want to stand out and get to the point. And sometimes instead of spending all of this time and effort on like building something super polished, you can try something scrappy. I don't know if you've seen those where it's like, I've seen a bunch of these where it's like, it's an image of I think like a Microsoft Paint window where it says like, our marketer has left, please buy our product, or something silly like that.
Yeah, totally.
It's, I think the commonality there is like, how do you be creative and stand out, like do something that is going to really stand out in the newsfeed. And that might be, it's like ugly ads trend, but it's also the case that a lot of people talk about, especially targeting a younger demographic like Gen Z. A lot of people mention around Gen Z that they don't want to be sold to, like they don't want to consume something that is like this like elaborate pitch. They want something that like is an ad but doesn't really feel like an ad. And so yeah, I think there's all these like trends and stuff that are interesting to keep an eye on, but I imagine that anybody who will just go and like take the latest trend or something and like use that for their ads is not necessarily going to work unless they have that deep understanding of like, who are my customers, what do they want, and then yes, let's try all these different ad formats and understand what works. I think the ugly ads piece also talks to a battle that's often between performance marketers and more typical brand folks, where it's all like as simple as like, if the ad creative doesn't have a call to action, it's hard to produce real results when you're not driving somebody towards something. Whereas, for example, in the ugly ad, it might be very direct and you're really leaning into a call to action that people are responding with. Whereas like the more polished, like storytelling approach is engaging, but like it's not clear. You're not driving people to an action. So I think that's something that is important for direct response. You really do need, a call to action driving people to a next step that you want them to go to.
And the other thing to remember too is this, my friend Paul reminded me of this a while ago with a post. It's like you have to remember what the job of each part of your funnel is. Like you don't need, sometimes you want to give them the brand story and a bunch of information in the ad, and that'll help, but quite often your landing page does that, or your product page does that. You just want to get them off the platform onto your page. And so I think that's where some of these ugly ads can work. If you're able to do it with enough understanding and intent that you get them to your page so that they'll convert, but just getting that click can be the job of the creative, right?
Yeah. And one thing I feel like we're still not at a place where we can answer this, where it's like, I think direct response advertisers still have an expectation that every creative asset is going to drive performance, right? It's difficult to justify a creative asset that's going to spend a lot of money that on its own is not going to deliver a lot of real results. But intuitively, everybody agrees with this, that like it can't be that every single asset is like hardcore direct response, bottom funnel messaging. Like it can't be. And we know that like when somebody purchases, they've interacted with a number of different ads, and maybe some of those like helped warm them up. And then the one that is the most like hardcore direct response, like that was the one that's going to take all the credit. But I think about it as like even let's say the brands who are more experimental and say, we want to lean into more like brand storytelling type of creative, targeting a more kind of higher funnel audience. I think with that, there's probably some kind of minimum performance threshold that creative needs. Like, we need this creative to perform at this threshold. But if it can perform at this threshold, even if it's lower than some of these other creatives, we're okay with it because we know that the messaging of this creative is like warming a lot of people up, and it's still hitting a threshold that kind of justifies us like putting spend behind it. So I think like if direct response advertisers want to do a lot of this like kind of multi-stage of the funnel messaging, I think that's the way to get away with it. Is say even if the ones that are more like the intent of this creative is to warm up more audiences that are going to convert with other assets down the line, they still need to be held to some level of performance. Maybe you're a little bit more lenient on what that is if you have strong conviction that creative is doing a great job creating new demand versus just like capturing demand, which is what some creatives, some assets might do. So I think some of that's cultural too. We're like having these like discussions around strategy as a team on what are we actually trying to do here versus run more ads, make more money. And like, I think it's become a little bit more complicated than that with regards to how to set up these functions. It's not as easy as it used to be.
I remember it was back when I was trying to build an audience of boomers to sell CBD. I think I was looking at Shoelace, and I had this idea of like planting and harvesting in a way where you'd blast out like low cost video ads that sort of told your narrative, and your main metric there would be like percentage through the video to know that they've kind of got the story down, and then you'd retarget people that watched various aspects of I remember that was a big strategy for local. I know for restaurants and things like that was sort of like I forget, the strategy was not called crop dusting. That's something else, but it was something like that. It was some strategy that was about it was like carpet bombing. That sounds terrible, but it was something to do with like layering an audience with video and then going back once they've been more warmed up. Is that something that people still do, or is that like when you talk about like this idea of like more content based off and more lower funnel based? Do you think people are quantifying it in that they're targeting the audiences that watched it and then seeing a higher conversion rate than they would otherwise?
I remember a lot of that talk several years ago. I think we're seeing less of it only because like the platforms seem to favor letting their algorithms just do the work, and as opposed to getting really fancy with like let me micro segment, let me create this one segment here and like target them like that. I hear less of that these days, where it's more like the algorithms in some sense have gotten smart enough to do some of that for you, where I think a lot of that is happening, but I think it's just happening in the more consolidated, let Facebook kind of figure out how to do that. So I think Facebook's algorithms are probably looking at a lot of that stuff, like who's watched some of the videos from this brand, and maybe let's make sure to like service more assets to those individuals who've engaged with some of these creatives. So I think I hear it less as like a tactic from day-to-day media buyers, but I think it's still happening as part of like Facebook's algorithm just getting better and better over the years. So as people build their creative mix, I think it's still interesting to think about it in that sense, where there's like a complementary relationship between the different creatives, where you have like, I don't know, all of the key messaging that you want to talk about. If they all exist within your portfolio of creatives, I think it all kind of works itself out for people to be exposed to those creatives in a way that's just simpler for media buyers. They don't have to do all of the like tactical work to set that up.
Just let the algo cook.
Just let the algo cook.
Let the algo cook. I really like your point about not making room to still be weird and creative. It's funny. I think back to Abe's, who comes on this podcast quite a bit from Pilot House, and she's like all of the things that she does that are a little bit more weird in creative. She does a lot of like EGC, employee generated content for her clients. And it's like the weird, quite often those little bits of personality and those sort of like things, the creativity that you put into things ends up being what people are gravitate to most. And I think it's really easy to kind of come out of the game, be like, okay, I need some UGC, I need a founder story, I need like, and there are all these sort of defined things that we talk about doing. But if you're not innovating in those, or if you're not being creative, it's very easy to come out as just another also ran. And you can be like, oh, well, I ran all the kinds of creatives that I was supposed to. But if you're not really making them weird and hooky and interesting and putting your own spin on them, you're less likely to find those unicorns.
Yeah, and so like, you mentioned unicorns. Like the other label of unicorn can be attributed to the people at companies who are truly equal parts artist, equal parts science, right? And I think those individuals really move the needle for brands today. And I think when we talk about the creative strategist, that's another dimension of that individual, is that they have almost like this perfect harmony between the creative side and the data side. Because as soon as you go a little bit too far in either direction, it's not going to work. And it's really interesting that I think this has been true for a long time, where people talk about like, the harmony between performance and brand. And I think we've just never been at a point where it's as critical as it is today, that it's almost like unless you have that perfect balance today, it's impossible to make it work. Because if you're just too creative, too edgy, etc., then like, it's going to be based on whims and not like solid foundations, and that's probably not going to work. And if you're way too data driven and you think that this whole thing is just this like ABC formula that you can cook up, well, you're going to learn that you can't. This is, especially when we talk about like social advertising, like there's an element of content creation that is meant to be engaging and like consumed by real individuals who are scrolling their feed all the time. And so you have to have that creative element. So I think it's about, within organizations, finding the people at their companies that maybe they come from the data side, the performance side, maybe they come from the creative side, but finding the individuals who have a ton of curiosity about the other side and helping them get there. So if you have somebody on the creative team who seems to be really interested in the numbers and being like, I tried this thing, I'm very creative, but I'm very eager to know like what happened. I actually want to look at the data and I care about that stuff. Then that person maybe has a lot of potential in the organization to be, motivated to go down the creative strategist path, or the person who comes from a more media buying background and it's like, media buying is great, but I feel a little bit bored these days. We're like, let the algo cook is like the way. Maybe I think I have a more creative side in me, and with all of my understanding about like what seems to work well in the platforms, and like data comes natural to me, let me explore my artistic side and see if I can come up with new assets. I think that is the recipe today. And I think the people that have had this historically, like people generally call them like unicorns because it's very hard to come by. But I think brands need to be more deliberate about creating these individuals at their companies, because they can have a really, really big impact on just everything downstream if you have more of these individuals on the team.
And if you want to have a bunch of unicorns, you got to give them a kitchen to cook in, and that sounds like what Motion is. Motion sounds like a place where you're going to give those creative strategists the kitchen to really like let both sides of the creative and the data side flourish in an easy, manageable place.
Yeah, everything about Motion is about trying to create more of those individuals. It's something that we care quite a bit about. So the entire product from top to bottom has been designed with this idea that how do we bring these two worlds together, regardless of which side you come from, will help you learn the other side more easily from the product standpoint. But even from our content, we produce a lot of content around helping people, whichever side they come from, get a better understanding of the other side. Our Creative Strategy Summit that I talked about, it's set up with two tracks. So one track is the art track, one track is the science track. So if you're somebody who comes from a more kind of data background, I would encourage you to go and like check out the art track of the summit. Or if you're somebody who's more on the creative side, I'd encourage you to go look at some of the science stuff. We have one session on contribution margin and what is that? Why does that matter for a creative strategist? Like, it would be cool for somebody who comes from a creative background to go to that session and get a better understanding of some of the data side of the operation. So everything that we try to do with Motion is to help individuals become those unicorns at their companies and have a really big impact in their work.
Very cool. So that's coming up October 26th. It's a free creative strategy summit. You can go to motionapp.com to register for that. Anyone wanting to tighten up their creative game should be in attendance. Also motionapp.com to sign up. I'm just looking at your speakers here. You got some unicorns. You got Cody Plofker. One of the top performing, and you've got True Classic. You got lots of great brands. That's going to be a good event.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it. We thought about the sessions that we wanted to talk about and cover, and we were like, from all the people we know in our network, who are the absolute best individuals to talk on these topics? And so, very, very excited about the roundup. And it's a free event, and people will get a ton out of it. Every session will be recorded, so you'll get one. There's one session that I'm quite excited about. I don't know if you remember, some time ago on Twitter, there was this beef between Taylor Holiday started it around.
I was about to bring up Taylor Holiday and cost caps. Let's go.
Well, he brought up this idea of like, I'm about to throw away creative metrics because I don't see the correlation between creative metrics and performance. Prove me wrong. And like, Twitter got lit up from that. And Jess from Fire Team, I think they had like a bunch of back and forth around like baseball analogies and trying to predict like home run winners, etc. And it was really fun, like back and forth. And I noticed, so we're bringing Taylor and Jess and somebody from the Motion team for a live panel debate on creative metrics. Are they valuable or are they vanity? And we're going to go down that conversation I'm very excited about.
Oh, hot takes are the way to go. Do you have any hot? I think you've already given us some hot takes, but to end here, do you have any closing hot takes that we can cut up and clip for you?
Oh man, my hot take is hire a creative strategist. Take the leap. Hire a creative strategist, and it will change the game for your business.
Amazing. Well, let's end it there, Reza. I think you'll have to come back and keep us abreast of other creative trends in the future. But this was a lot of fun, man. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Go to motionapp.com. You want to attend their creative summit or chat with Reza about how you can get more unicorns in your company and in your campaigns. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. If you're not a subscriber to our newsletter, you can do that right now at direct-to-consumer, all one word, .co. I'm Eric Dyck, and this has been the DTC Podcast. We'll see you next time.